So I wanted to ask you about breath holds. And so my control pause was always very low, and I've always been a stressed, anxious kind of person, and that was the reason I got into breathing. And so I had a low control pause, and then I got to spend time with a free diver. His name's Tom Zitas. He's got the most world records for free diving. He held his breath for 10 minutes on a single breath of air, and he taught me his techniques. And I didn't get 10 minutes, but I did get 3 minutes. And this was in water, so there was mammalian dive reflex kicking in probably as well, and a few other bits. But a big part of what he taught me was relaxation and visualization and using the emotions. And so it made me go back and wonder how much of the breath hold is chemistry and how much of it is willpower or emotional, something else. And I'd just love to get your thoughts on some of this because it's been bothering me for a while.
Yeah. It's all three things. That there are three types of impulses or three types of inputs into, the breaking point of breath holding. There is probably number one, most important, is feedback from respiratory muscles. So the respiratory muscles, the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles, are sending messages to the brain, saying it's time to breathe. And they'll do that kind of in line with the kind of programmed neural drive for a regular breathing pattern. And, that's, for a long time they thought, it's chemicals. It's the rise of CO2 or it's hypoxia that gives the drive to breathe. But that chemical drive probably comes in as the second most important influence. And the third, of course, is psychological. And if you hold your breath, like I did some research on breath holding. I don't know if you saw my paper, but I wrote a paper that was testing the Buteyko control pause. Because Buteyko's theory was that the control pause correlated with CO2, that it could tell you what a person's resting CO2 was, and that you could tell if the person was a hyperventilator on the basis of the length of their breath holding time. And he actually patented that formula. And so I repeated, that research and got quite different results. Probably, not that Buteyko's research was wrong, but he got what he got in his cohort, working with people who were different, to the group I had. But the group that I had were just people with concerns about their breathing. They didn't necessarily have terrible dysfunctional breathing, but they had some kind of concern. They were asthma, or they just didn't think their breath was great, or subjectively they'd made some judgment about their breathing. So we measured, I measured CO2 with very good, super accurate equipment for 20 minutes and took an average. So, did it lead in for 2 minutes till the CO2 stabilized, then took continuous readings for, about half an hour while they were, distracted, like by filling out forms and things like that. And then we looked at the correlation between breath holding time and their CO2. And we found that it didn't really correlate. And in fact, there were two outliers that had very low CO2 and 60-second control pause. And it was like, oh, wow, this kind of blows it, doesn't it? This is weird. And the other thing I did was I measured their breathing pattern by evaluating, their resting breathing pattern using a protocol called the MARM, where you put your hands on a person's back and you look at the balance of the breath. How balanced is it between the upper and the lower rib cage, abdomen region? And I found there was a correlation with the MARM. There was a correlation with their resting habitual breathing pattern, with how their diaphragm was operating. But there was not a correlation with the CO2. So, that was just my data. And when you do research, it's like you get your data and then, you publish it. You make sure that you did the study properly. And your reviewers, have a sort of haul you over the coals and check everything. And did you do this? Did you do that? And that paper got published. But also, as I'm writing the paper up, I'm going and I'm having a look at, well, what have other people said about breath holding time? And it used to be like, based on the work of Campbell and so on, there was this theory, which would have been around the time that Pateko was doing his work, saying that, it's chemical drive, that creates the breaking point for breath holding. But then the more recent research is showing, actually, no, it's feedback from respiratory muscles. That is the stronger thing. And there was a really interesting bit of research that they did quite a long time ago. And you can tell it's quite a long time ago because the research would never get through ethics these days. And what they did was they took a group of medical students and they paralyzed them with curare, the Amazon hunting poison. And they paralyzed them with curare. And so these young medical students are lying around not being able to breathe by themselves. So they artificially ventilated them. Then they stopped the ventilator. And then they let their CO2 rise and their oxygen drop. And at a certain point when it was getting dangerous, they stopped. And then they asked the students, when did you feel breathless or the urge to breathe? And they said, never. So they would have, with all their muscles paralyzed, they would have died without feedback from breathing muscles. So that being said, hyperventilators do have short breath holding time. They do. And it's quite a good measure. And if you get a breath holding time like below 10 seconds, then what you know is that person has a strong ventilatory drive, coming from their brain. And people with asthma and so on, they'll have shorter breath holding time. But it's not necessarily a clear reflection of their CO2. It's a reflection of their dyspnea threshold, meaning how easily they get breathless. So it will determine how they breathe, their breathing pattern. It will determine how they use their diaphragm. And it will, to some extent, it will also determine their CO2. So I still use breath holding time, but I don't absolutely make decisions. I used to in the old days, I'd make a decision about what their CO2 probably is on the basis of their breath holding time, but now I don't anymore. I can't, because that's not what the data showed. So now, my assessments are multidimensional. So I will measure CO2 at rest and under challenge. I will, use various challenges, sit to stand, just standing, sitting, hyperventilation, provocation test and recovery. And I get quite a lot of information to decide what's happening with that person and their chemical drive to breathe. And then I assess biomechanics. So I'll check the diaphragm, the rib cage, what their breathing pattern is doing, and I check how functional the breathing pattern is. So I look at the breathing pattern in different postures, slumped, upright, and then I look to see how they respond to breathing instruction when I say, take some big deep breaths, breathe shallow, breathe into my hands, and so on. And then from that, I get lots of information about the functionality of their breathing pattern. A lot of people talk about functional breathing as if, functional breathing means that you don't breathe through your mouth and that you don't appear to be breathing using your rib cage and shoulders. And people use that term, and a lot of people go, oh, we're training people to have functional breathing because they're teaching them a particular style of breathing that's considered to be optimal. But, my model, and honestly, a lot of my PhD was thinking about, what is functional breathing? And what I sort of came to was like, functional breathing is just breathing that fulfills the functions of breathing. So then the next question is, what are the functions of breathing? And there are primary functions, which is regulation of oxygen, CO2, and pH. Then there's the functions of breathing. The primary function of breathing is about breathing as a pump, moving air and fluids. And then connected to those primary functions are secondary functions, which, self-regulation is a secondary function of breathing. Creation of oscillating rhythms that influence other neurological and physiological rhythms within the body. speech and vocalization, cardiorespiratory interaction, and so on. So it's sort of like the body has to fulfill all those functions at once. So the body can't be breathing the same way all the time. You can't be breathing that way all the time, because breathing has to maintain homeostasis and fulfill a whole lot of needs at the same time. So functional breathing is breathing that's flexible, adaptive, and appropriate. So it's I use that acronym EARS. I say, okay, functional breathing is breathing that's EARS. It's efficient. That's an acronym EAARS. So efficient, adaptive, appropriate, responsive to body systems, and supportive of homeostasis in multiple systems simultaneously. So it's not like, we don't want people mouth breathing. But you know what? Sometimes mouth breathing is the most functional. And sometimes there's something very lovely about using the mouth to breathe. It can feel really great to take some breaths through your mouth. And it can be a really great way to train the pharynx and the upper airway. So I just say, break the rules, but never get fixed on somebody's idea of perfect breathing. Keep your mind open and always go back to the physiology, go back to the functional anatomy, go back to considering the person and their situation and their needs, and then make your decisions about what functional breathing is at that point. That being said, of course, it's better to have, nasal breathing. It does, provide so many benefits and functions. And yes, it's better, you want a diaphragm that's working. But, in some people, the most functional breathing, if they've got a flat and hypertonic diaphragm, the most functional breathing is actually to lift their chest to breathe, because their diaphragm isn't doing anything. So then it isn't what's the most functional breathing in this person. Let's just force them to breathe with their belly and their lower rib cage, because you make them more breathless, and that's been shown in a number of research studies where they've looked at people with COPD, and physios focused on just the breathing pattern, the biomechanical dimension of breathing. Start teaching them belly breathing, and they get more breathless, because they need to use the chest to breathe, because honestly their diaphragm's not doing anything. And then the step, of course, you can get them breathing with the diaphragm and the lower rib cage, but then what you need to do, you've got to first of all relax the diaphragm. You've got to get, reduce the hyperinflation, and then you'll get more diaphragm action, and you might need some manual therapy to release that diaphragm, or you might need to work with the psychology of the person, because sometimes the diaphragm's staying low, flat, and hypertonic because of some influences coming from above.